he kicked the wrong waiter in the wrong restaurant on the wrong night. Before this story ends, a millionaire will beg on his knees, a room full of elites will fall silent, and a single father's buried past will turn a moment of cruelty into a reckoning no one saw coming. If you believe respect is earned, power should be humbled, and hidden strength always rises, subscribe now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who really holds the power. On the night everything changed, the restaurant glowed with money and arrogance, a cathedral of crystal chandeliers and hushed entitlement where laughter was measured and worth was calculated by watches, suits, and the ease with which men spoke down to those who served them, and among those servers moved Daniel Cole, a single father with tired eyes and steady hands, balancing plates like a man who had learned long ago that precision kept chaos away. His mind split between memorizing orders and wondering whether his daughter Lily had finished her homework before falling asleep clutching the old hoodie that still smelled faintly of him, because Daniel worked nights not for ambition but for survival, the kind that came quietly and demanded sacrifice without applause, and nobody in that room knew that the calm in his posture came from a past carved by discipline, violence, and restraint, a past he had buried the day Lily was born, choosing parenthood over the shadows that once shaped him. The trouble arrived in the form of Marcus Hale, a self-made millionaire whose reputation for brutality was mistaken for confidence, a man who believed money was proof of superiority and cruelty was a privilege earned through success, his voice loud, his laughter sharper than necessary, his guests orbiting him like planets afraid to fall out of favor, and when Daniel approached their table with a practiced smile and a quiet greeting, Marcus barely looked at him, flicking a hand dismissively as though shooing a fly. Already annoyed by the idea that someone like Daniel existed within arm's reach of his tailored reality, the first mistake was small, almost invisible, a glass placed slightly too close to the edge, a drop of water touching Marcus's cuff, and in any other world it would have earned nothing more than a sigh, but in Marcus's world it was an insult, a challenge, and he stood abruptly, chair scraping, eyes narrowing, voice rising just enough to turn heads, demanding an apology as if Daniel had committed a crime, and Daniel gave it immediately, sincere and calm, lowering his gaze not in submission but in control, yet that calm only fueled Marcus's rage because bullies feed on reaction, not resolution, and when Daniel turned to fix the situation, Marcus lashed out, his polished shoe slamming into Daniel's leg from behind, sending pain shooting upward, a deliberate act meant to humiliate, to remind everyone watching who held power. The room froze, forks paused midair, whispers died in throats, and Daniel staggered but did not fall, his body absorbing the impact with a reflex too trained to be accidental, his muscles tightening in ways that did not belong to a waiter, and for half a second something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, something old and lethal, before he buried it beneath the image of Lily's face, breathing once, steadying himself, choosing restraint when every instinct screamed retaliation, and when he turned back, Marcus smirked, emboldened by the silence, asking loudly if the waiter had a problem, and Daniel answered softly that there was no problem at all, that he would get a fresh napkin, and that should have been the end of it, but cruelty rarely stops when it goes unanswered, and as Daniel walked away, Marcus kicked again, harder, deliberate, cruel, this time meant for spectacle, and Daniel went down to one knee, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the room, the manager rushing forward, guests murmuring, phones discreetly appearing, because humiliation spreads faster when witnessed, and Marcus basked in it, mocking the clumsiness of staff, tossing a bill onto the table as if paying for entertainment, unaware that in that single moment he had crossed an invisible line, because Daniel did not rise immediately, not because he was weak, but because he was choosing, counting heartbeats, forcing the beast inside him to remain asleep. And when he finally stood, something had changed, subtle but unmistakable, the way his shoulders aligned, the way his eyes lifted, not angry, not afraid, but focused, and across the room, an older man with a scar along his jaw stiffened, recognition flickering in his gaze as he watched Daniel move, because some people know the posture of fighters, and some truths, once seen, cannot be unseen. The aftermath unfolded like a slow burn rather than an explosion, because real power does not rush, and Daniel returned to work, limping slightly but refusing help, his mind retreating inward where memories waited like locked doors, memories of underground gyms, of commands barked in foreign languages, of hands broken and bones set with tape and silence, of a life where violence was currency and survival depended on ending fights before they truly began, and he had walked away from it all when Lily's mother died, disappearing from records, burning bridges, choosing anonymity over dominance, because raising a child demanded gentleness, not glory. Yet as the night wore on, Marcus's behavior escalated, each drink sharpening his tongue, each laugh louder, mocking Daniel openly, telling his guests stories about putting servants in their place, and the restaurant staff grew tense, management afraid to intervene because money spoke louder than morality, while Daniel endured it with a patience that was not weakness but strategy, watching exits, noting distances, cataloging threats as instinctively as breathing, because some habits never leave you. The turning point came when Marcus decided humiliation was no longer enough and called Daniel over again, this time standing so close their chests nearly touched, the smell of alcohol and arrogance thick between them, and with a sneer, Marcus reached out and shoved Daniel hard, fingers digging into his collar, daring him to react, daring him to break, and something shifted in the air, a pressure like a storm about to break, and before anyone could intervene, Marcus swung, sloppy but vicious, a punch meant to shatter dignity, and Daniel caught it, not by chance, not by luck, but with a movement so clean and controlled that the room gasped, his hand snapping up, twisting Marcus's wrist at an angle that froze him mid-motion, pain blooming instantly, and Daniel leaned in just enough to whisper something no one else could hear, words calm, measured, final, reminding Marcus that violence was not a game, and then, in one fluid sequence that lasted less than 2 seconds, Daniel disarmed him, swept his leg, and sent the millionaire crashing to the floor with a force that rattled glasses and silenced the room completely, Marcus screaming in shock more than pain, his arm locked in a hold that could have broken it with a fraction more pressure, and Daniel held him there, not crushing, not gloating, just controlling, his voice steady as he instructed Marcus to breathe, to stop fighting, to listen, and the irony was suffocating as the man who moments ago believed himself untouchable lay powerless beneath someone he had deemed invisible. Security rushed in too late, guests stood frozen, phones openly recording now, and the older man with the scar finally spoke, his voice cutting through the chaos as he addressed Daniel by a name no one in the room had ever heard before, a name tied to fights whispered about in places that did not exist on maps, and Daniel's grip tightened for just a heartbeat before he released Marcus and stepped back, surrendering himself to security without resistance, because the message had already landed, and as Marcus was helped up, shaking, humiliated, his authority shattered, he looked around for allies and found none, the room silent, judgment heavy, the illusion broken, while Daniel was escorted away, head high, knowing consequences would follow, but also knowing that Lily would never have to see her father bow to cruelty, and as police lights painted the street outside in red and blue, and whispers turned into headlines, one truth echoed through every witness who had seen it unfold, power built on money collapses quickly, but power built on discipline, restraint, and purpose endures, and this was only the beginning, because the past Daniel buried had been seen, recognized, and once awakened, it does not return quietly to sleep. By morning, the video had escaped the walls of the restaurant and taken on a life of its own, spreading across phones, newsrooms, and group chats like wildfire, slowed only by disbelief, because people were used to seeing power abused but rarely to seeing it reversed so cleanly, so decisively, and Daniel sat alone in a small interrogation room, hands resting calmly on the metal table, answering questions with the same measured tone he used when helping Lily with her spelling homework, explaining that he had acted in self-defense, that he had tried to walk away, that he had warned Marcus without raising his voice, and the officers listened, trading looks, because nothing about Daniel matched the stereotype they expected, not his posture, not his eyes, not the way he never once blamed anyone but simply stated facts, and when the older man from the restaurant finally arrived, badge clipped to his belt now instead of a suit, the room shifted, because recognition carries weight, and he asked the other officers to step outside, closing the door softly before turning to Daniel and using that buried name again, the one Daniel hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, the one tied to an era when he had been trained to end conflicts before they began, when his fists were registered weapons and his silence was enforced, and Daniel corrected him gently, saying that name no longer existed, that he was just a waiter, just a father, and the man nodded, understanding more than he said, explaining that Marcus Hale had already called 3 lawyers and a publicist, that money was moving, pressure was building, but so was public sentiment, because the footage didn't show a victim, it showed a bully exposed, and for the first time in Marcus's life, money couldn't buy control of the narrative fast enough. By afternoon, Daniel was released without charge, and when he stepped outside, blinking in the daylight, he found Lily waiting with the restaurant manager, her small hand clutching a stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with worry until she saw him, then relief flooding her face as she ran into his arms, and Daniel knelt, ignoring the ache in his leg, holding her tightly, whispering that everything was okay, that he was there, that nothing would ever take him away from her. Even as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions he refused to answer, shielding Lily with his body the same way he had shielded strangers for years without recognition. Marcus, meanwhile, spiraled, his empire built on intimidation cracking as partners distanced themselves, sponsors pulled out, and an old pattern emerged: threaten, sue, silence, but this time it failed, because too many people had seen the truth, And when Marcus tried to spin the story, claiming assault, the full unedited footage surfaced, including the kicks, the shove, the sneer, and public opinion turned mercilessly, not with outrage alone but with something far worse for men like him, ridicule. And days later, Marcus found himself standing alone in a courtroom where the judge did not care about his net worth, only about evidence, and when Daniel testified, he spoke not of anger but of boundaries, of choosing restraint until no other option remained, and the judge listened, and so did the world. The ruling was swift, clear, and final. Marcus was found liable for assault, ordered to pay damages, and issued a restraining order that publicly cemented what the video had already shown. And outside the courthouse, reporters asked Daniel if he felt victorious, if he planned to capitalize on his newfound fame, and Daniel shook his head, saying only that he planned to go home and make dinner for his daughter, because some victories are not meant to be monetized, they are meant to be lived quietly. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm, slower but heavier, because the past never reappears without cost, and Daniel received offers, security firms, training academies, interviews promising money and exposure, but he declined them all until one letter arrived, handwritten, from a foundation that helped victims of workplace abuse, asking not for spectacle but for guidance, for someone who understood power dynamics and restraint, and Daniel accepted quietly, teaching self-defense to people who had never been taught they were allowed to protect themselves, not to fight, but to stand their ground. And Lily watched from the doorway sometimes, pride shining in her eyes, because her father was not a hero in headlines, but a protector in practice. As for Marcus, his name faded, his influence shrinking, his anger consuming him in private where no audience remained, and one night, months later, he saw Daniel again by chance, standing in a grocery store aisle comparing cereal prices with Lily, laughing softly at something she said, utterly ordinary, utterly free, and Marcus turned away, because nothing is more devastating to a man who built himself on dominance than seeing the person who humbled him living well without needing to prove anything at all. And Daniel never looked back, because the fight that mattered had already been won, not with fists, but with restraint, integrity, and the quiet strength of a father who refused to let cruelty define his world. And in that silence, louder than any applause, the truth remained. Real power does not shout, it does not kick down, and it never needs permission to stand tall.